It makes me think about our practices of listening and responding, how it's more important that we're working on our capacity to hear and respond to God appropriately than how are we going to fix all the problems around us.
And now as we move through Genesis, it's just in this downward spiral that kind of hits the bottom when we come to the story of Noah.
Right, and imagine that you're an Israelite and you're hearing these stories from Moses. And it's like starts with, wow, this is this beautiful connected world, but we've decided not to participate in the connected worldview anymore. We become so self-focused and enamored with the lie that humanity's moved away from being connected and they're drifting into greater levels of separateness. And how if I think of it like you're coming back each day to hear the next part of the story and it's getting worse. Think how they must have felt.
Yeah. And when you say choosing not to participate, the connection worldview is really the kingdom of God that Jesus is inaugurating when he comes on the scene in Mark chapter 1. And it's there whether we believe it or not, right? But it's our choice to participate and be able to receive all the benefits of being in union with the living God.
Yeah. So imagine you're hearing good news like that, the good news of the kingdom of God, or for the early Israelites, they're hearing, wow, the world is beautiful and amazing and stunning, and this is what we get to be involved in. And they've experienced none of that. And wouldn't you be asking, why did we do that? Like, why are we not choosing this connection, this beautiful kingdom of God? Why are we walking away from it? And so you hear the story of Cain and like, well, because he felt like God wasn't going to make it fair or something like that.
It's what he felt.
Right, exactly. It just makes these stories, they're ancient stories, but wow, they're so relevant to today. If we hear them and read them in the way that Moses is explaining them, from Cain and Abel and that separation even between brothers and that scarcity mindset and that deep conflict, the whole world just continues in that downward spiral. And we see this in the story of Noah.
You know, it reminds me of something you read not too long ago about, I think it's called The Fate of Empires.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So Sir John Glubb, British historian in the 1950s, wrote a paper called The Fate of Empires. And he was charting the history of all empires beginning back in Assyria and forward into the British Empire. And it's almost like he was saying the story of Noah is what always happens in every empire. And he said the pattern of the rise and fall is so common that by the third or fourth empire that he was studying, it was boring. Civilizations begin, they rise, they come to a pinnacle, and then they start to decline. And they all end up falling apart. No empire lasts. And all of them, it takes about 275 years before the whole process, before they're gone.
But don't they start very connected with some common, can you describe that?
Right, well, they start as creative minorities that come together, and they're communities that are based on value of connectedness and acceptance and tolerance and other focused. We're coming together. We need each other. We don't mind where you're from or who you are, what you believe. Let's get together. And usually it's a reaction against an empire that's collapsed. So they've been inside an empire that's on the downward slope, and the empire is very greedy and imperialistic, and it starts to collapse. And then this new, we're not going to do that again, group, and we're going to be other focused. And it's really the connection worldview that they're talking about. Like, let's help each other and let's honor who's around us. And they start that way. And then as they begin to survive and they get kind of comfortable, then they shift to like, well, let's take more land. They start with like, we have enough, it's okay, this is great. But then they're like, well, it'd really be good if we had that over there too. And they start to spread out. And they move away from the idea that we're connected to everyone. They start moving into like, well, really everyone needs to kind of be a part of us. We've kind of got it together. So really everyone needs to be a part of us. And so they start conquering places around them as they gain more power. And then the pursuit becomes not of liberty and freedom, but of power and control. And the turning point in all of them is when there's a shift in education, which I think is fascinating. What happens is as they're educating their populations, all of these civilizations, they come to a point where the education system moves away from education is the pursuit of knowing things. That's the goal of education, to know. How do we know things? How do we understand things? It's their epistemology. What's our way of knowing? That's the goal of education. How do we know things? And then what do we know? It moves away from that in every empire where education shifts to how do we get the highest paying jobs? And when the culture makes the shift that education is all about just how do we get the most affluent lifestyle possible? What do I need to know to get that? And that's when it's the tilt. The tilt begins into decline.
Goes from knowing to achieving.
And what almost immediately disappears is the idea that community and public service occupations are the most important, which is what they were, into they're not really important. Those jobs are not important. And the culture starts denigrating public servants. They're low paid. They're kind of we don't really like them. We're critical of them. Teachers, police, all of those. And so there's no public service. It's all about private acquisition. And it just the whole thing starts to fall apart. To the final evidence that the empire is going to cave in completely on itself is that instead of honoring teachers and firemen and police and all of that, they begin to honor celebrities and athletes.
Wow. This is sounding a little too
Doesn't
familiar.
it sound very close to home? And so if we chart our own country, the United States, on this, we're already over the pinnacle and on the way down. Because we worship athletes, we worship celebrities. And when someone says, I want to be a public school teacher, it's like, we're sorry, that's the only thing you could come up with. Moses is warning against this.
Yes.
It's astounding. And he has a document in there where the philosophers and religious leaders of a civilization are bemoaning the fact that the young people only elevate and worship singers and athletes. And it was 9th century Assyria.
Wow.
That far back, they knew that was a bad idea.
Wow.
And so, we can just look at our world today and say, we're kind of in big trouble.
Yeah.
We are really on the way down.
Yeah.
So when we look at Noah's day, we see this happening. The separation model is so widespread, the scarcity model is so widespread that it says, and the people are so self and inward focused, every thought is continuously evil. Like that's what they've denigrated too.
Where's the hope for today?
Yeah, where is the hope? And I think part of it is for us to be able to look at our world and say, yeah, we are in this predicament, to truth tell. The connection model is all true. It's still true. There's enough for everybody, but we've got to stop and say, really all we're doing, everything that we're promoting, everything that we're saying is great, is really all about scarcity and self-interest.
You said something interesting when you were talking about the fate of empires, that it started with a small group, you called them creative minorities.
The creative minority.
And I think we're seeing that when I say, where's the hope? I have a lot of hope in that, because I do think today in modern times, even though we're seeing that downward spiral and we're seeing more and more of the separation worldview, people just embracing it as normal. Look at politics, and not just in our country, but lots of different countries.
Right.
Look at the rise of wars, just so much conflict all the time. But this idea of creative minorities is really beautiful, that if we're intentional about going through these processes and really pursuing living in our true identity and being connected to one another and to the planet, that there is hope.
Yeah, and another writer calls them islands of sanity, that in this turmoil and in this chaos that we find ourselves in, that we can form islands, small groups of sanity. And so then you have to think about Jesus coming on the scene in a world that's all imperialism and occupation and subjugation of weaker people. And he comes into this system and he forms this island of sanity with these 12 disciples, and he begins to move out. And I think that's what we're seeing with Moses telling the story of, the whole thing's kind of going down the drain, but there is an island of sanity. There is a creative minority in the midst of all this chaos that's leading to disaster. And that island of sanity and that creative minority is Noah and his family.
Right. And that's going to lead, I think, to it's the people he's telling the story to.
Right.
It's you in this world. It's the Israelites.
So let's look at Noah as an island of sanity.
God found favor in Noah and found favor in his faithfulness and his righteousness and called him out in his true identity to make a change here, to make a difference.
Right. I think what's happening is everything is just unrestrained. It's just everyone's doing whatever they think is right. And again, we have to apply that to our situation.
Yeah, it was utter depravity.
Right. And everything's okay, and you can't tell me what's right and wrong. And every person's doing what's right in their own eyes. That's what's happening. And yet Noah, as you're saying, is not conforming to the patterns of the world.
Yeah, that's good insight.
He's not allowing himself or his family to be involved in that. And he shines out like a star in a dark universe. And God says, this one has found favor in my eyes. He's maintained his identity, right? When Moses is telling the story of Noah, he's saying this can be us. This can be us as a nation. This can be us as individuals, that no matter how bad it's getting, to the point where if it were possible, God might be sorry that this even happened, that he even created it. If that were possible, still there's a connection point. Still the connection model, the connection worldview works. And Noah's the example. So it's really a story of hope, I think.
So what is Noah not doing?
Yeah, I think that's the right question, because what would we do? What do we do when our whole neighborhood is in chaos? And do we just maintain our identity as a witness for what's true, or do we, in our own fear, start to act out of scarcity and separation? Right?
You have to think, when you say that, it makes me think just during the pandemic and the hoarding of the toilet paper and walking in the grocery store in just utter shock that there was nothing. There was no food. The shelves were empty. And it was a terrifying feeling. And then it's terrifying, fear, something's wrong here. But out of that fear, then we start hoarding because we're in self-protection. It's all about me. It's not other-focused.
Right. So even though in my mind I have a connection worldview and I believe God's going to take care of me and all, but when I go to Walmart and the whole town is there ahead of me buying everything they can, the temptation is for me to shift immediately into that same mentality and do exactly what.
And there we are, conforming to the pattern of the world.
Right. And it's back to Cain, where God's saying, be careful, because the enemy, the temptation to live in that worldview is right there, and it will master you and everyone else in it. You must master it. So we're looking at Noah in this chaotic world. What is he not doing? He's not fighting. He's not organizing campaigns against bad people. He's not saying, running around telling them they're all, going to perish and go to hell. He's not doing any of the things we might do that we would do out of fear. He seems to be pretty quiet.
Yeah.
He seems to be pretty, well, he's just okay. He's over there and he's in the same world as everyone else, but he's not panicking. What a way to live with peace and joy in the midst of the chaos. And I think it's what we see Jesus doing.
Yeah, it's
also.
a sign that you are fully connected to God, yourself, others, is that peace. I will keep you in perfect peace if your mind and imagination are fixed on me because you trust me. And it seems like Noah at this time in history was the epitome of that.
Yeah, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the time that we were invited into the state prison in Texas.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a high security prison. So you're in a world where probably everyone's there because they did pretty much what they was right in their own eyes while they were out, in society. And so a lot of violent offenders and that kind of thing. And
a lot of lifers, too,
right,
I think.
Yes, and think of their identities. Mm-hmm. Think of how they view themselves in that now they're locked together. And we're in a culture that the way we handle broken people is to isolate them away in separation. It's like we do the very thing that violates the plan of God in connection and restoration and reconciliation. So we've put all these broken human beings in one place and locked them all together. Doesn't seem like a good idea, but remember this amazing woman that went in there to work, and she was a widow, and in her own journey discovered her own identity and feels like God's inviting her into this prison, and she goes in there at age 72 or 3.
Yeah, I think she was 72, into a men's prison. Right, feeling that nudge from God, and she didn't resist it.
That's right.
She followed through and miraculously got permission to lead a Bible study in the state penitentiary in Texas.
And so she goes in among these men and she teaches them about identity. She doesn't tell them what they did wrong and all of that. She teaches them who they really are.
Right.
And
you're not your crime.
You are not your crime. That's right. And this environment does not define you. You are a creation of God, and God's connected, and he's never left you. He's never forsaken you, even though you killed your brother or whomever, whatever you've done. And she has this amazing thing going. And what happens to her is the inmates that she's working with are mostly Caucasian and some Hispanic. But one day a group of Muslims in the prison come to her because they've heard of what's happening. Like she's like Noah in the midst of this chaotic world, and she's a light to them. And so they come to her and they say, we're Muslims. We know what you're doing. You're teaching the Bible. Can we as Muslims come into your group and be a part of your group? Interestingly, she said yes, but some of the Christians said no.
Wow.
Like, no, this is a group for Christians. You're not welcome here.
Wow.
So there she is. She's the creative minority. She's modeling a worldview of connectedness and the mystery of having the different groups together and the creativity of that. And let's try it and see what happens, But these guys don't want them in there. So she called us and we went in there, and I went to meet with the Muslim leaders in the prison. And when I met with them, and I met with their leader, who was in solitary confinement all the time. They only brought him out so I could meet with him. We talked a little bit, and he was actually a very smart, he was a special forces soldier that got addicted to drugs in Afghanistan. And so he ended up doing robberies and ended up in prison, but he was a decorated special forces soldier, very interesting guy. And I said to him, will you say in front of the Muslims in the prison, because you're their leader, what you're most afraid of in life? Can you do that? So what Noah is doing is he's standing above all of the pressure to believe in this world of scarcity and fighting, and he's just a truth teller, and he's standing in his true identity, but he's not fighting them. And I just said to him, can you say the truth of what you're most afraid of in front of these Muslim men? And he got really upset. And I said, you're afraid that I'm asking you that. And you're trying to come across as brave and fierce, but really a real leader would just be able to say to his guys what he's most afraid of. So can you say that? And finally he says, I'm afraid of heroin. He'd already been in prison 10 years. And he said, I know that if I ever get released, the heroin still owns me. The heroin still masters me.
Wow.
Even though he's this trained elite soldier. And he said, and I don't know how to overcome it. And I said to him, I can tell you right now how to do it. I can walk you through that process.
So he still had the false identity
Absolutely.
of addict.
Yes.
Right.
Right. Even with all of his medals and all of that, didn't change the way he viewed himself as a victim. And so we walked through this process of hearing God in front of his guys, and God spoke to him, and God broke him free of the fear. And it was so dramatic to him that he said to the Muslim community, no matter what everyone else says, let's go in and be a part of what's happening with God among the other inmates. And the warden told me these groups never mix. They never mix. The separation is too great. The hatred's too great among them. And so we met with each of the groups, and we agreed to do an all-day Bible study in the gym. And I invited the Muslims to come. And I said, if you would come into this, we could stop being separate and we could form this one community inside the prison. And what we're going to talk about is identity. And so the day the event started, there was a little band playing, and it was all the Caucasian guys and Hispanic guys, and the Muslims weren't there. And we were going, and they were singing about Jesus, and all of a sudden, all the guards tensed up, and the doors open, and in comes this guy. And he's chained. He has chains on him, but he comes walking in, and behind him are all the Muslims of the prison. And they all come in, and they walk, and they sit in the back 2 rows we had chairs set up for them, and they sit in the back 2 rows, and the music stops, and everyone's super tense. And the lady, the 75-year-old lady says, play the music. She yells out, play some music. Everyone's just staring at each other intense. And they start singing the song about Jesus. And the Muslim guy stands up, and he raises his hand, his chained hands above his head, and points to heaven while they're singing about Jesus. And all the Muslims stand up behind him and point to Jesus. And then everyone in the room points to Jesus. And they start this whole community of people connecting over Islam, over black and white, and all the different crimes they committed. They become this very unified 300 of them group singing to Christ. After 1 week of that, the warden contacted us and said both the lead guy and the number 2 Muslim guy had asked to be transferred to other prisons, which they can. They have the right to be. They don't change their status, but they can be moved. And they each moved to a different prison. So they went to 2 different prisons. When I asked them, I made contact with them, why did you leave this prison to go to that one? And they said, to spread the news of the kingdom of God.
Wow.
And so this whole movement started. So when we look at Noah, what is Noah not doing? He's not fighting. He's not rallying people against the bad guys. He's staying connected to God. And in his connection, he's giving the world hope. And that's what we can do. We need to think about what are ways we can be in the world and not of the world, but we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, right? We're not fighting against crazy bad people. We're wrestling against the lies that imprison them and the brokenness. So I think that's what Noah is representing, and what he's going to show us how to do that.
And it's no joke when we say live fearlessly in your true identity.
That's right.
Because if there was ever a time to be fearful, I think it was that time in history. And Noah really was standing firm against the scheme of the enemy, the lie, and living fearlessly in his true identity.
So he didn't fight, he didn't engage in political warfare and all that. So let's look at what did he do? What did he do?
What did he do? We heard what he didn't do. What did Noah do?
Right. So he doesn't see himself as separate from the rest of the world. I think that's fascinating. He's not separating himself. So what he is doing is he's walking in the truth of who he is. He won't move into a false sense of himself, no matter what's going on around him. The way he does that is by obeying God.
Now, that's a loaded word when you say
really is.
Obeying God. Because when we think about obeying, we think if we don't obey, we're going to be punished, right? But actually, in the Hebrew root of the word, it means to listen and respond.
Right.
We all have the ability to listen and then choose to respond in an appropriate way. And that's very different than obeying. Obeying strikes fear in our heart. If I don't obey, I'm going to be in trouble. But I love the thought. It makes me excited to think that God's going to communicate with me and I can hear him, I can listen, and then respond appropriately. And that's what we're seeing with Noah. He's just listening and responding.
Yeah, this, it's so encouraging. Just this humble guy who he can hear God, who listens to God and responds. And the scriptures tell us that obedience is better than sacrifice.
So listening and responding is better than sacrificing.
Right. So if we jump back to the idea of Cain is all hung up on the sacrifice. And what God is saying to him is like, what's more important than what you're bringing is your ability to hear and respond to the truth of who I am and the truth of who you are.
Wow.
It's greater than anything you'll ever bring to God.
Yeah.
And so Moses, for whatever reason, understands this, and he's more committed to hearing and responding to God than anything else. Mm-hmm. And so every action he does is a kind of offering to God. So God gives him this amazingly creative idea, right? We're co-creators with God. And so it's like the whole world's going down the drain, but in this little island of sanity, this little creative minority, here's an idea of what to do. Imagine if we were living that way, instead of reading the New York Times or whatever, Fox News or whatever, and just freaking out that the whole thing's going down the drain. It's like, oh, wait a second, what about Noah? Like, what about Jesus? What about the ability to hear and respond? And God, how do you want us to think about what's happening in our world?
Yeah, and, he wasn't just getting a nudge in the spirit to bake cookies and take them to his neighbor. He's being asked to build an enormous vessel, and he's never experienced rain.
Yes.
He's never experienced a flood. Does he even know what he's building?
Right.
So the opportunity there, or the temptation to resist, it seems like it could have been huge, yet he didn't. He didn't necessarily obey, but he responded.
Right.
He just listened and responded in faith.
And think about if he was living in a separation worldview where he would only operate in certainty. He would have never done any of that because he would have never been certain exactly what was going to happen. So if we require certainty to follow God, this isn't really the way the world works and the way that God set it up. He's connected to us, and there's enough for everyone. But wow, is it a mystery?
It's a huge mystery, and it requires, the Christian terminology is faith, but that's really trust. It requires just a trust, and that's always risky. But we can see story after story where that risk paid off, where that risk, that sense of following God ended up really well for people.
So Moses is telling the story of Noah to the Israelites, anticipating, I'm sure, as Moses himself has already experienced, that the way this is going to work out is going to be different than what we think. Like, we probably have no idea how this whole thing's going to work out, but mystery is part of what's true. It is a mystery, and it's not A, B, C, D, and that's what happens. It is a mystery, and God, in leading us into mystery, is going to wow us and awe us and make us really thrilled about life, because that's what we're made for, and we're going to have to co-create with them as we go along. So Noah is co-creating with God to avoid disaster. That's what's happening there, right? It makes me think about our practices of listening and responding, how it's more important that we're working on our capacity to hear and respond to God appropriately than how are we going to fix all the problems around us.
How can you and I stay connected if we don't communicate? And a common thread that I'm seeing is God pursuing these different people that we're talking about, and he's communicating to them. And so how are they perceiving these communications from God? And how do I hear from God? And part of it is just taking practice and being aware that he's speaking to us all the time.
Right.
And even more so today because we have the Holy Spirit, right?
And staying in community with different kinds of people and asking them how do you hear from God? How does God communicate to you? And so we can share the mystery of how God communicates. Remember when we went to work in the West Bank and we were going into that situation, which is a complicated, fearful, separation whole story that's been going on a long time in that region. And going in there and really we don't know what to do, right? When we're going into a situation, we don't know what to do. So how the practice of our team is really what we've saw Noah do, right? We gather together, we ask God questions, we listen for answers, we write down answers, and then we build a strategy based on God's instruction to us, right?
Yes. It reminds me of David in Psalm 27, where he says he just longs to be in God's temple, gazing upon his beauty and asking him questions.
Right. And so as we do that, in the connected worldview, in the mystery, we're not afraid to make mistakes. So remember we were asking God, show us, lead us to the person of peace in Palestine, where there's only 5 million people. Where's the person of peace? How do we find that person of peace? And then how do we work with that person of peace? All mystery to us, all mystery, but believing that God could lead us. And I remember we heard that there had been an American working in that region who had been, they tried to kill him and he had to flee. But he told us, he communicated to us, there was one guy in there, one Palestinian Muslim that was open to the kingdom. And we were asking him, who is he? Well, I can't remember anything really about him except his first name, which was the first name of every person in Palestine. And, but I don't know how to find him, but I know he's there. And I know if you make contact with him, he'll respond to you. So what do you do? What do you do with that?
So we have a first name and we have multitudes of people. And I remember praying and asking God to help us find this guy, just to miraculously show us who it is. And we were in Bethlehem, right? And we were near the Church of the Nativity, where they believe Christ was born, and there's a church now, right? And what happened?
Yeah, and so then we were moving around and just talking to people. And I was off by myself, and I'm talking to this guy. And I say to him, did you ever meet an American in the last 5 years? Just this total random, bizarre question. And he says to me, maybe. And I'm like, maybe. And I said, is your name? And I say the name, and he says, maybe. And so then I think, maybe this is our person. And I'm just asking God, like, do I continue? I can't help but think about Noah as he's building this thing. And people are asking him, like, what are you doing? And he probably can't fully explain it, like, because it's a mystery to him as well. It's like, well, I'm building this ark and we're going to put animals on it because it's going to rain. None of which is ever understandable to anyone. So just think, if he got his identity from what people thought of him, he would quit.
Be in trouble.
He would stop. So it's kind of ridiculous how I'm talking to this guy and the idea that even he could possibly be this one person. And so I ask him, I just feel like asking him, have you ever read the Injil, the New Testament? And his answer to me every time was maybe. But as long as he didn't say no, I was like, okay, so maybe. And then I say, do you own an Injil? And he said, I might have one. Now I'm super encouraged. And I said, if you have one, because I think you're a person, that I want to know. I said, would you do something? Would you go home tonight and read it and read the story of Moses and the Apostle Paul and ask this question: how do those two men know who they are? How do they understand who they are? Just think about that question. How do they know their identity? And when you figure out how they know their identity, will you ask God to tell you your identity based on how they know their identity? And if you hear an identity, here's a phone number where you can call me, because it's very tense, and they don't like to contact foreigners because of Israeli
security.
And so I said, would you just call this number? And if you don't call, it's fine, no problem. And I just leave, and we leave. And I don't know, like a week, 2 weeks, he calls me and he said, I want to meet with you. So we pick a place to meet where we're pretty sure it doesn't look suspicious that I'm going in and meeting with a Muslim leader. So we pick this American or Western hotel that has a coffee shop that's usually pretty empty. So I go there first, totally empty. I'm like, perfect. And I sit down in the coffee shop. And as soon as I sit down, these two Palestinian secret internal police officers, because they wear a certain insignia, come in. So they're the worst possible people to show up. And they sit right, because they're nice Arabs, they sit right next to me.
They want to be connected.
They want to be connected. They're like, how are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm great. And we're in this conversation. And then I see the guy that I've been talking to, the young guy, he's 25. I see him come to the door of the coffee shop and see me sitting with these two security guys. And in his hand, the young guy, he has this giant red hardback Bible. And I'm like, where did he get that thing? And I can see in his eyes, he's trying to decide whether he's going to come in and sit near me with these two, like he's weighing the decision. And I feel like in my heart, God is saying, watch what he does, because if he's your guy, he's going to come. This is not going to stop him. If he's your leader. And so I watch him and I'm looking at him, and he comes walking in and he sets the Bible right on the table in front of the two Muslim internal security guys. He just sets it down on the table, and they look at him and he looks at them, and he says to them, do you have a problem with this book? He says to the security guys, do you have a problem with this book? And I think this guy is courageous. He's moving in his identity despite anything. That he could go to jail just for doing what he just did, potentially. And so he's young. And so the older security guy, I think, is impressed by his courage. I really think that's what happened. And he says, I don't have a problem with this. And he looks at the junior officer and he goes, do you have a problem with this? I don't have a problem with this. Do you have a problem with this? And the junior officer, who gets his whole identity from the senior officer, says, no, I don't have a problem with it. And the senior officer stands up and says, I think we should let these guys be alone. And they leave. And I know this is our guy. And this is our Noah in this world. And this Noah can build something in this chaotic, broken down, separated conflict zone where we are. And he sits down and I say to him, I respect what you just did because that was dangerous and I respect it. And he said, it's because I know my identity. That's what he says. And I said, how do you know your identity? He says, the same way Moses and Paul know their identity, God told me who I am. And I said to him, who does not tell you who you are? Who does not give you identity? And he said, Americans don't give me identity. Security officers don't give me identity. Israel doesn't give me identity. Nobody gives me identity but God. And I said, and what is your identity? And he said, when I asked God my identity, God showed me Moses with his staff and said, you are the leader of your people, lead them. And that's how he and I met. And you know him, you've known him for a long time. And in just a short amount of time, he built, like an ark, he built a place of safety and security for 10 other young leaders.
Yeah, virtual ark.
And then each of the 10 had 10 guys.
Yeah, I remember.
And how fast that spread. And it spread so fast that when the Salafi militant Muslims came in to recruit terrorists, young guys like him, he and his leaders kicked them out of their neighborhood. Yeah. And they said, we're not participating in this violence any longer. And I felt like there it was, the destruction is coming and it's been there, but because he stayed in his identity, he responded to God and formed a creative minority in that island of sanity, which has spread to quite the movement. It's Noah building an ark and calling all those on it to be rescued from the disaster that will come in the separation world.
So you're not a victim of your circumstances or the status quo of the day, but you can become connected, and in that connection, you're leading others. Connection is attractional.
Right.
If you're connected to you, then you're trying to connect with others. And it's attraction.
And his whole community around him is drowning in destruction and violence.
And fear.
But they rise above it and they are saved from that storm. And I think this is the message of Noah.
I think it's the good news of the gospel.